with regards to employment, CDLs, commercial driver's licenses. If you have experience, you have a choice of 4 to 6 jobs available to you because there's just not enough qualified individuals that can operate a vehicle like that and be licensed by the federal government in order to do that. So there's going to have to be changes in order to create that. There isn't a major transit system in the United States that is not adjusting their daily schedules based upon their inability to put all the buses on the street that they've promised the general public that they're going to do. So we are looking to automation and autonomy to some degree to assist us in being able to meet what we're promising the locals that we are going to be able to provide. There's nothing worse than telling somebody on an app or a piece of paper that this is when a bus is going to be there and it doesn't show because we don't have a person to put behind the wheel to operate it. We don't lack for a shortage of buses in this country. We lack for a shortage of the ability to put all of them on the street to service the needs of our citizens. So something needs to be done to change that from that standpoint. Some of the things that obviously anybody would know as you go through, it lowers our costs. Automation and autonomy will hopefully reduce risk. Obviously, those vehicles are all going to be powered by electricity or could be potentially hydrogen in the future, but it's probably not going to be your traditional diesel-powered buses that you see. So greenhouse gases will be reduced, carbon emissions will be reduced. There is a segment of our population that will gravitate towards new technology. So whether it's electrification or autonomy, people will choose to ride those systems if that is available to them solely because that's what those systems use as far as either propulsion or technology. We want to be able to, that we can appeal to that for people to, Wichita is never going to be hard to get around unless we keep piling more and more and more cars on the road, but it's never going to be a difficult city to get around. So there has to be reasons for people to decide why they want to park their car. And one of those things should be the technology, the autonomy, and then of course you bring in together things like convenience and whatnot. So, and obviously the human factor of autonomy creating, and in public transportation particularly, most of you probably have children and you've driven cars with children or even with parents or grandparents in your car, and people are talking, they're asking questions, phones are going off, kids in their back needling each other. I had 4 kids. I had distracted driving long before I had a cell phone in my hand. But take and try to imagine what it's like to be operating a public transit bus at 3:30 in the afternoon with 40 people on it. And you've got all the traffic on the road in Wichita, those 40 people behind you talking, doing this, school kids elbowing each other, hearing everything possible. Then you have passengers getting on the bus and they're asking you questions. How do I get on? How do I get off? How do I pay a fare? Oops, I got to get my money out. All of that stuff is distracting to the operator. But we don't have the things that normally exist and that we see in autonomous, some sort of level of autonomy of lane infringement or automatic braking. These are all things that are going to come down the pipe but don't exist right now. So a bus driver is trying to do all of those things together. You're not going to see a bus driver dozing off because they've got so much input coming from outside the bus and then inside the bus on top of that. And they have all this technology that's inputting into what it is that they do. So anything that relieves or reduces that is going to be seen to us on a day-to-day basis as something that we see as a plus. Right now, obviously, there's a lot more autonomy in public transportation in Europe and the Far East, just because of some of the lack of roadblocks that exist here. And it could be that there's newer infrastructure. Obviously, our infrastructure is very old, and those are the things that have to be, there has to be money expended, and you're talking billions and billions of dollars, and that's not always easy to come by. But there are some that were previously mentioned in some other presentations, but Orlando is getting into autonomous vehicles very heavily. There's a company called Navia which I think made a presentation last time. They have a very high, they actually have a sales force in Orlando, and they're actually trying to come up with applications for their product. Las Vegas, they've had a Navia system in place that they've been running. Again, not a lot of passengers per bus, but it is going in the direction of creating more and more opportunity for more and more people, because we do specialize in mass transit. Our buses are 35 and 40. We're going to be going to 30-foot buses and doing things to move around, but you're still looking like to move as many people as you possibly can, and how you accomplish that. This is just a short demonstration of actual autonomous bus on the street. It's in China, so it's not here. So you see that this represents what we would consider to be a public transit bus operating in an autonomous mode. There's still an operator there. He still is able to take control. But again, you're moving people at the quantity that you need to in order to accomplish that. So obviously, from our standpoint, that would be a huge advantage. But again, what's the certification of that operator compared to what an operator has to be certified at today? That man's operating technology that doesn't even exist on most public transit buses in the United States. But it is an amazing video to see, especially when that gentleman has a lot of confidence in what it is that's being shown to him. And obviously the people on the bus are very comfortable with it too. I don't know if I would sit there like that if the guy had his hands off the wheel, but yeah, again, you can see, and the thing that the conversation always comes up about is how do these two dovetail together? Are these two buses communicating to each other? So are you able to actually have one bus that's working? I know Tesla's working on this, where tractor trailers that are on the highway, you have the lead tractor that's being controlled by a person, and the other ones are feeding off the data from that. So that's possibly a way that public transit will be able to incorporate this quicker than others would be. If you look at the amount of money that's being spent on autonomous trucks and buses worldwide, 84 million in 2017. I think we all know that pace is going to get more and more brisk as time goes on. With the, in 2022, they're talking about, $35 billion being spent in that revenue market. So that's a huge investment, which is going to drive what it is that we see on our roads for the next 15 to 20 years. As I mentioned before, we have had some conversations in Wichita with the company Navia. Just recently, we've been approached by a company called Ollie, and that is what they produce. That is I believe, an 8-passenger version. We have a Smart Cities initiative going on here in Wichita that's being run by the IT department of the city of Wichita. We are working closely with them. We're hoping that we will be able to put together an autonomous pilot program in conjunction with Wichita State that would use a vehicle similar to this on a loop that would be closed on the site of Wichita State, closed from the standpoint of there would not be other vehicles that would be operating on that part of the roadway, so that this vehicle could be used for that, because it can't be used on public roads. But we can create a loop here with Navia. We actually did a lot of pre-look-ats and studies and to determine whether we could create that, and we found that we could. So it's really a matter of getting a hold of the proper hardware in order to do that. And obviously, from our standpoint, downtown Wichita is becoming more and more vibrant. We have a baseball field going in. You've got Old Town. You've got hotels that are coming in. There's a lot of things that are going to be changing over the next few years in the downtown Wichita area. We run the queue. The queue will be electrified again in the first quarter. So anybody that's using the queue starting in January, February, this is all going to be electric, not the old diesel, loud, stinky trolleys that look nice from about 30 feet away, but when you get closer, they're not so pretty. They break down a lot. They're very noisy. You can't carry on a conversation inside or outside of them. That'll be completely changing. This is a system that could complement a queue typical downtown circulator system to, again, allow a different experience. We want to make sure that it's ADA compliant and has ramps and things, and Ollie, much like Navia was, is working on that. So we're very excited about where this could possibly go, especially in conjunction with WSU, to advance this technology to the point that it could be potentially used in an actual public application at some point in time in the Wichita area. All this to give you just a quick synopsis of what Ollie, how it started, what it does. Obviously, these are the types of things that we would expect to see. You know, apps. We're going to be rolling out a micro-transit system here in Wichita, and everything will be based, it's a demand response transit system on the west side of Wichita in a certain area, and all the drivers or all the operators will have tablets. People will be able to use their smartphone, schedule trips. The trip will tell them exactly where they're going to be picked up, when they're going to be picked up, and it's from their vicinity right to their destination. It uses a lot of technology. A lot of what we do is app-driven now, and obviously a lot of the things that are driving autonomy and also public transit application of autonomy are going to be app-driven. We're seeing more and more federal and state money being earmarked for autonomous research. Now, like any other funding source, there's always a lot more demand than there is resource. Typically, when we apply for a grant, it may sound like it's a large amount of money, but a grant, let's say, is $426 million. You'll probably get at least twice the amount of that in requests. So it's one of these things where there's currently a lot more demand than there is resources in order to do that. Hopefully that will change, and as that does, then you'll see more and more of these funding sources get better funded, and also, because when you look at those numbers, they're really small in comparison to what other countries are investing in that type, but it has to start small and build, and hopefully the pent-up demand and the push from the standpoint of the public sector will help to drive those. And obviously Wichita, the city of Wichita, Wichita Transit, and Wichita State want to be part of those things, and hopefully in a few years in the future we'll be able to say that we're doing the most that we can and the best that we can in order to advance those types of programs. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Appreciate it. And we thank all of our presenters today. They're now going to come up and take questions for you. We don't have a lot of time left, but we're going to try to go through a few questions for you this morning. And again, we thank all of our presenters giving us this wonderful information, all this new technology on autonomous vehicles. Been very, very, very interesting and educational. And we thank you for coming. Once we get everybody settled and situated, we'll move on into our question and answer session. And don't forget, we're going to have our next session coming up in January. And registration, as Debbie mentioned earlier, starts next week. All right, everybody ready? Okay, so to get us started on our question and answer segment, I'm going to throw a question out there and any one of you can answer. Then after that, we have folks out there with microphones, and then you in the audience can ask a question. So here's our first one. In many places, especially smaller rural towns, transportation for the elderly and people with disabilities is limited or non-existent. How do you see autonomous vehicles or shuttles helping? And will this technology make it to rural Kansas? Anybody can grab that one?
I'll take the first crack at it.
Okay.
I think that's really where autonomy could help. from the standpoint of accessibility. Again, you struggle with in the manpower side of finding enough people to provide that rural type of service. I mean, in an urbanized area, it doesn't take us long to get from point A to point B and to get to the resources that people need as compared to a rural setting in Kansas. Obviously, at that point in time, you have more wide open spaces, you have the ability maybe to control the environment a little bit better, but also too, again, you get into that at what level and how easy is it to put the human aspect into it, because that has to be maintained, obviously. But again, I think autonomy from that standpoint could have a significant impact on the ability to deliver those services in the rural area.
Awesome. Anybody else want to tackle that?
Yeah, so I can kind of respond to it from more kind of global viewpoint. In terms of the automation, I think that is one of the goal or one of the foresee a benefit for be able to provide transportation system for people that's really in need. I know, for example, in Japan, there's a lot of elderly population, and that is one of the focal area that the Japanese government, they are doing a lot of research on. Back in July, I was in Florida for the Automated Vehicle Symposium. I was speaking in that meeting. One of the demo they had is there's a city that's thinking providing that type of service too. So I think that ultimately is that we will see a great benefit be able to provide accessible transportation to people, elderly and other people that has a need. And I think that should be definitely be a focal area for as we are pushing for in the future.
Okay, thank you. All right, let's go to you out there. Anyone have a question? Okay, there we go.
Well, I'm going to make a comment on your question first, and that is I'm from McPherson, and I've been working with Michael Tan for probably over a year, and we have such an opportunity to be a dynamic economic area from Wellington to Salina, what I like to call on meetings I-135 corridor. We have to come up with some of this transportation because in some of our rural areas we have the ability to put in manufacturing jobs, good manufacturing jobs, and so we need to tap a population outside of where we're at. And that's what we're trying to look at is how do we move people back and forth in the I-135 corridor via some of the ideas of Wichita transportation, ACCK out of Salina, or some of the app things that Michael inferred can be work within the inner city. Can they also work in a regional area? So. And you have a long stretch of interstate highway, which is fairly straight type thing. So I guess my question is more maybe for Mark or something, Wampo in this area. How do we focus more on a regional impact of this and not simply metropolitan area?
So one of the things that we really got into when we were developing the autonomous vehicle framework at MARC is that we tried as much as possible to use our existing regional planning efforts and not do something completely separate and create new mechanisms for engaging, because those types of things will end up only attracting the people who are interested in it and not necessarily all of the people that it will impact. And so we did have a separate steering committee for the AV framework specifically, but there was significant outreach done to our area agency on aging, to our Head Start group, to our transportation policy committees, to our bicycle and pedestrian advocacy organizations, to our workforce development. We had those 5 other topic areas that I didn't get to that each had their own working group on. One of those was workforce and economic development, and how not just the technology jobs and the proliferance of engineering and new jobs in Kansas City, but also workforce transportation. and how can this impact how people get to and from employment. And so I think going through existing mechanisms, chambers of commerce, economic development corporations, groups that are already focused on those types of social issues, and making sure that that education piece reaches them too, and not just your traditional transportation planning partners that come to the table for the highway transportation, you know, that you're making sure to engage the organizations outside of just your traditional transportation planners in the conversation, because the impact is more wide-ranging than just how I-35 is going to run during rush hour.
I think I probably can comment on that a little bit. We started our driving simulation software back 2.5 years ago, and we started to build a local digital map based on Wichita. So, and the plan is to build the whole Wichita area in the virtual environment, and we want to train and test our local people within using the automated vehicle in the simulation. So probably that could help to bridge the gap between nationally available resources and the general technology, and try to connect with the regional resources.
Yeah, one of the conversations that we had a lot in the education realm was that you don't even have to own a vehicle with the adaptive assistance to, like when you rent a car and you go out of town, rental cars are generally newer and have these technologies on them, even if what you're driving at home doesn't. And so we talked a lot with our senior centers and other organizations about doing driver re-education and just having the optional, basically driver's ed, but on new vehicles, and getting people more comfortable with the existing technology because it's moving forward farther. So back to just engaging in areas that aren't traditionally engaged in transportation planning to make sure everyone stays up to speed as much as possible.
Okay, so so much information. It was incredible. I knew a little bit about this, but I learned a lot more today. So I think it's safe to say, at least from my viewpoint, that levels 0, 1, 2, and 3 are driven by humans, where 4 and 5 are not, correct? Okay. So you talked about a lot of drawbacks, you know, of doing levels 1, 2, and even 3, which we didn't talk a whole lot about, I don't think 3 today, of the learning curve for humans who are driving these vehicles. And I guess my question for you guys is that really delaying us for the progress? What I want anyway is to be able to sit in a vehicle and not have to do any driving, and I can do whatever I want to do at a level 4 or level 5. You know, are we worried so much about levels 1, 2, and 3 that we're not focused on 4 and 5, or are there companies that just focus strictly on levels 4 and 5, not even worrying about 1, 2, and 3, you know, and so on? So I've got a lot of other things I would like to talk to you guys about, but that was kind of my main question.
Sure, I'll try to answer that first. So level 1 is really what we call the ADAS system. I mean, they are basically commercially available in many vehicles. Level 2, pretty much the same. You have right now, you have 2 vehicles that has the level 2 function. One is the Tesla Autopilot, and one is the Super Cruise system. I'm talking about the passenger vehicle. Level 3 is in one of those gray area, depending on which auto car manufacturer you talk to. Some are kind of bypassing that because I think Carol has mentioned in her research, there's a lot of unknown because that transition stage from the car to the driver. There's actually a number of well-known large car manufacturers that they are doing testing in Europe, in Asia, as well as in the United States, that's looking at level 4. Now, your question asking whether or not, there's concern about the transition that can kind of impede the progress. I think it's much more complicated than that. I think we were talking about today focus more on the human driver. So looking into that. But there's also other aspect of it we haven't really touched upon. For example, the issue about cybersecurity, right? Issue about digital mapping, because digital mapping is like the eyes and the algorithm, about learning all this, the ethical issue. the insurance issue. So there's just many components. If you do a Google search on like conferences related to automated driving, you can pretty much go to a conference, 2 or 3 conferences each month on different topic related to law, related to different issue, because it's just it's such a complicated problem. So I think that it's for me at least, it's kind of difficult to answer that. I don't think there's a cut and dry kind of something we can point to and say that's not working. For example, earlier Mike mentioned about the autonomous shuttle. You know, I mean the first set of testing was done in Europe. Basically, Spain and France are the first 2 countries that began doing that. But many of these testing we are talking about is in a much more controlled environment with low traffic volume and so forth. So I think we are making progress. But this progress, I think that every time when you do a progress, you want to do it carefully so that you don't have a major setback. I think to me that's how I see it right now. Yeah.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
All right, yeah, Andrew Weens from the Wichita Chamber. Thank you all for your presentations. Dr. Baldwin, you had a slide in your deck that showed a couple of pilots like looking back for a photo and a plane oncoming, kind of humorous. I'm wondering if there are lessons to be learned from aviation, and you know, you hear about autopilot, and obviously there's a lot that pilots are doing when they're flying a plane, and there's been studies done on why planes crash. There's less traffic in the air, but still some, you know, terrible crashes, and some of that could be, you know, due to inattentiveness after flying for hours on a long, you know, transatlantic flight or something. So are there lessons to be learned on attentiveness for drivers on roads that we can kind of glean from air and piloting?
Yeah, good question. I think there are a lot of lessons from aviation that we can bring to the table for automotive. And hopefully we are doing that in many respects, you know, a number of those lessons. But there's some really unique differences as well. I mean, if you look at commercial pilots, they receive an extensive amount of training, much more than the average driver receives. But yeah, there's additional issues. One of them that we've looked at with aviation automation is the issue of mixed equipage, it's called. And I don't think we're paying enough attention to that yet in the automobile industry. We're going to have that level 4 or 5 vehicle on the road, but it's going to be interacting with that 1975 vehicle that doesn't have any of these technologies. And already we've seen instances like with emergency braking, that car equipped with that may be able to stop much faster than the human would be able to stop on his or her own. But what about the car behind it? If they don't have that system. So the aviation industry has looked at that, issues like that, and the need to maintain training. The other thing with automation that we can learn from aviation is skill loss. So that's well known. If pilots are required to fly a number of manual hours just so they don't basically forget how to fly manually in case the automation fails. And I think, you know, I mean, it's not tomorrow, but in the near future, we may have a whole generation of drivers that never learned to drive manually. We've already got a generation of drivers that never learned to drive without anti-lock brakes, that they don't know how to drive manual. So if all of a sudden those systems fail, it's not just can the driver take over, they may have never learned some of those skills. And so I think, yeah, there are a lot of lessons we can learn from aviation.
Okay, that's all we have time for. We sure thank you again for coming. Don't forget, the next session is January 31st. That one is Infrastructure, Security, and Vehicle Considerations for Autonomous Transportation. Registration starts next week. Again, let's give a big round to David Yang, Carol Baldwin, Ray Nee, Mike Tan, and Amanda Graor. Thanks, guys.